The hum of engines filled the cabin like a steady heartbeat, the kind of sound that faded into the background until it was all anyone could hear. It was a late-night transatlantic flight, the kind where exhaustion and restlessness mixed in the air. Cabin lights glowed in soft amber, casting shadows over rows of travelers who shifted in their seats, tugged at blankets, or scrolled through glowing screens. A child whimpered, hushed by a weary mother. The flight attendants rolled carts down the narrow aisle, their polite smiles practiced, their hands steady even as turbulence nudged the wheels. Businessmen murmured into headsets, couples argued in low voices, and every so often the quiet was punctuated by the metallic clink of glasses. Near the window, seat 18A, she sat with her posture straight but unforced, a presence both ordinary and strange. She wasn't glamorous, no glossy hair or sparkling jewelry. No perfume trailing through the air like most of the women dressed for travel as though it were a runway. She wore a plain sweater and jeans, black sneakers scuffed at the toes. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical knot, no makeup to soften or sharpen her features. Yet her face had a quiet beauty, the kind that didn't beg for attention but drew it anyway when eyes lingered too long. She held a worn paperback, its cover bent, the spine broken in several places from years of reading. Every few seconds she turned a page, her fingers unhurried, but her eyes weren't truly on the book. They flicked up once to the aisle, once to the seat ahead, once to the overhead bin where a man had shoved a heavy backpack earlier. She scanned without seeming to, like someone who had trained herself to notice what others ignored. The way her gaze lingered on the small details, the flight attendant's hand trembling slightly as she poured coffee, the row of men in 22 whispering in a language most around them didn't understand. The way their bags bulged unnaturally beneath the seats, it wasn't obvious, but it was deliberate. She seemed calm, absorbed, but every movement of her eyes said otherwise. The captain noticed her during boarding. He was a seasoned man in his mid-40s, shoulders broad under the navy uniform, silver creeping into his temples. His face was lined, not from age alone, but from years of sleepless nights in hotel rooms and endless miles over oceans. He carried himself with authority, but that night he felt the fatigue pressing harder than usual. As he stood by the cockpit door greeting passengers with mechanical nods, his eyes caught on her as she stepped onto the plane. There was nothing flashy about her, no rolling designer luggage, no impatient sighs, but the way she walked, deliberate and measured, made him pause. He watched her settle into her seat near the window. She didn't fuss with her bag. She didn't struggle with her seatbelt. She simply sat down, opened her book, and breathed as though she'd already calculated every exit on the plane. He told himself he only noticed because she reminded him of someone he couldn't quite place, maybe a figure from a training memory, maybe just a shadow of someone who once sat in that same row. But even as he prepared his flight plan, checked weather updates, and exchanged easy jokes with his first officer, his eyes drifted back through the crack of the door, searching her out like an anchor in the sea of restless passengers. Meanwhile, in row 22, the three men whispered. Their voices were low, but their movements weren't. Their eyes darted too quickly, never resting on one thing. One shifted his bag under the seat twice, tugging at the strap as if to reassure himself it was still there. Another drummed his fingers against his knee, his leg bouncing with a nervous rhythm out of sync with the hum of the engines. A flight attendant paused near them with her cart, offering drinks, and their response was curt, dismissive, their gazes sharp and evasive. No one else noticed. People were too lost in movies, books, and sleep. But she noticed. From her seat, she watched the smallest flickers, their heads leaning too close, their glances toward the cockpit, the weight of those backpacks pressing heavy against the floor. She turned a page in her book, her face calm, her breath steady. On the outside, she was just another woman on a long flight. On the inside, she was already counting, already preparing. The captain checked the gauges, unaware that the quiet in the cabin was about to fracture. Something about this flight was different. He couldn't explain it yet, but he felt it in his bones. And when his eyes caught hers again through the aisle, he realized he wasn't the only one who knew. The seatbelt sign had long since gone dark, the plane steady at cruising altitude, when the aisle erupted. 3 men burst forward from row 22, their masks half pulled over their faces, weapons raised high enough to catch the glow of the cabin lights. The sound of their boots pounding down the narrow walkway shattered the uneasy calm of the flight. Screams tore through the air. A child shrieked, his cry swallowed by the sudden chaos. Luggage rattled in overhead bins as passengers pressed themselves against windows, clawing for space that wasn't there. The first man shoved a flight attendant so hard she stumbled into a seat, her tray scattering drinks and ice across the floor. The intercom crackled alive, a harsh voice cutting through the din. Nobody moves. Nobody speaks. This plane is ours now. His accent was thick, his tone practiced, meant to frighten. The second man had already forced the cockpit door open, the lock useless against their assault. Within seconds, the captain was dragged from his seat, his body hitting the floor hard enough to draw a grunt. The first officer's hands trembled above the controls as a rifle was pressed to the back of his neck. The intercom blared again. "Stay in your seats, or you die. Cooperate, and maybe you live." Panic consumed the cabin. Passengers sobbed into their hands. Some clutched each other, as if skin to skin could ward off the inevitable. Flight attendants stood frozen at the ends of the aisles, their faces pale, their practiced smiles shattered into masks of terror. A woman in a fur coat clutched her pearls so tightly the chain snapped, beads scattering across the floor. A businessman whispered prayers, his knuckles white against the armrest. Amid the storm of fear, one figure remained still. She did not scream. She did not plead. She did not bury her face in her hands or throw herself to the floor as the others did. She sat upright in her seat, back straight against the window, her hands folded loosely in her lap. Her breathing was steady, controlled, as though the chaos around her belonged to another world. The paperback she had been reading still lay open on the tray table, a finger tucked inside to keep her place. Eyes began to find her through the panic. Passengers huddled low in their seats, but their gazes crept upward, drawn to her composure like moths to a flame they did not understand. Whispers spread, first faint, then sharper. "Why isn't she afraid?" a man muttered, his wife clutching his arm tighter. "She's crazy," another hissed, darting his eyes toward the aisle where a gunman barked orders. A mother pressed her child's head down and glared at the woman over her shoulder. "She's going to get us all killed," she spat under her breath. The suspicion twisted in the air, latching onto fear like dry tinder. Every tremble, every sob, every frantic prayer made her calmness look unnatural. Some passengers turned away, unwilling to meet her gaze. Others stared harder, their panic searching for an explanation, a scapegoat. One man in a rumpled business suit leaned toward his seatmate, whispering hoarsely, "She's not right. Maybe she's with them." Still, she did not move. Her eyes lifted once, tracking the man pacing the aisle with his rifle, then dropped back to the page of her book, as though she had chosen to ignore him. Her chest rose and fell in even rhythm. Her fingers did not shake. In the claustrophobic crush of fear, her composure was louder than any scream. It unsettled them more than the gun in the hijacker's hand. The cabin was no longer united in terror. It was divided those who cowered, and the one who did not. And in that division, suspicion grew sharper than the edge of any blade. The gunman's boots struck hard against the aisle as he stormed toward her, the muzzle of his weapon locked on her face. Passengers shrank back, shoulders pressed against windows, breaths caught in their throats. The metal gleam of the gun caught the dim cabin light as his voice thundered. On the floor, now. His rage filled the narrow space, vibrating through the rows of terrified onlookers. Mothers clutched children tighter, men buried their faces in their hands, and someone hissed from 2 seats back, "Do what he says, don't make it worse." She didn't flinch. Her hands remained folded loosely in her lap, her posture steady against the window. Her eyes lifted slowly to meet his, calm as still water, and something in that composure made him falter half a beat. The pilot, forced down and cuffed at the cockpit doorway, caught her expression. He saw no fear, no wild panic. What he saw was calculation, like she was watching the rhythm of a pendulum, measuring angles and timing each breath against the moment. He had flown with soldiers before, carried units on their way to war, and the look on her face now was the same he had once glimpsed before men jumped into combat zones. Not fear, focus. The gunman screamed again, spittle flying. "I said down!" He lunged forward, shoving the weapon inches from her forehead. Gasps rippled through the cabin, some passengers cursing her under their breath, others closing their eyes as though bracing for the shot. And then it happened. She shifted, smooth as water. One step to the side, weight sliding out of the gun's line, her hand snapping up to trap his wrist before the trigger could twitch. In a single practiced motion she twisted, and the man's own momentum betrayed him. The weapon clattered against the aisle floor, metal striking with a hollow clang that made the nearest passengers flinch. Her elbow drove into his jaw with a precision that was almost surgical, sending him crashing sideways into the seats. The impact rattled the row, passengers ducking beneath his weight as he slumped unconscious. 15 seconds. That was all it had taken. The plane was silent, save for the wheeze of the air system and the muffled sobs of a child. Then the whispers came. "She's one of them," a man in a suit hissed, eyes wide with fear. "She has to be." A woman clutched her husband's arm, trembling. No normal person moves like that. But another voice, low and uncertain, cut through. "Who is she?" The question lingered like smoke, heavier than the accusations. Her silence held. She did not defend herself, did not explain. She only stooped long enough to nudge the gun away with her shoe, sliding it beneath a row, her eyes fixed not on the crowd but on the aisle ahead. The second man broke from his shock with a roar, charging at her. His steps were sloppy with panic, his weapon jerking wildly in his grip. The passengers cried out, ducking, some covering their heads as though that thin layer of flesh and bone could protect them, but she moved before the terror could take shape. One hand snapped a seatbelt loose, yanking it across his body as he lunged, the strap tangling his arm. He stumbled off balance, and she seized a metal tray from the service cart left abandoned in the aisle. With a swift upward swing, it cracked against his forearm, the weapon flying free. He staggered, but she didn't give him time to recover. Her elbow drove into his ribs, sharp and final, forcing the air from his lungs. He collapsed sideways into the lap of a horrified passenger, wheezing, his fight broken before it had ever really begun. The cabin was stunned. Some covered their mouths in awe, others narrowed their eyes with suspicion, unwilling to believe what they had just seen. Whispers spread like wildfire, snapping and sharp. "She's trained. She's dangerous. She saved us. She's with them." Every voice clashed in the recycled air, but none dared speak directly to her. She stood motionless in the aisle, her chest rising and falling evenly, no sign of panic or pride, just silence. Silence that felt heavier than the fear, silence that unsettled them more than the violence they had witnessed. 2 men were down, the cabin was still intact, and she hadn't wasted a single breath. The cockpit was chaos, alarms shrieking as warning lights flared red across the panels. The last terrorist, sweat streaking down his temples, had shoved the throttle forward and was screaming into the radio in a language half the cabin didn't understand. His hands clawed over the controls, desperate, manic, as the plane dipped just enough to send a wave of nausea through the passengers. The captain grappled with him, his uniform damp with sweat, teeth gritted as he tried to wrench the yoke back under control. He was strong, practiced, but exhaustion and panic pressed against him like weights. He was losing ground. The cabin had dissolved into prayers and sobbing. Mothers clutched children against their chests. Strangers held each other's arms, breaths shallow, eyes wide. Every heart pounded with the certainty that the sky itself was about to swallow them whole. Yet, amid the storm, she rose from her seat, calm and unhurried, like she was standing to stretch after a long ride. Her steps down the aisle were steady, each one cutting through the chaos like a blade through fog. She reached the cockpit as the captain faltered, the terrorist shoving his forearm against the pilot's throat, forcing him back. Without a word, she stepped in. Her hand shot forward, catching the attacker's wrist mid-strike, twisting it back until the weapon fell with a hollow thud against the floor. With her other hand, she pressed her weight against his shoulder, driving him down toward the pedals. The captain seized the opening, shifting his leverage, and together they pinned the man against the panel. He thrashed, spit flying, curses spilling from his mouth, but she didn't waver. Her grip was unbreakable, her focus absolute. When the cuffs finally snapped into place and the terrorist lay bound, the plane steadied again. The pitch leveled, the alarms quieted, and a strange silence swallowed the cabin whole. It was not peace. It was heavier, raw, filled with the weight of what had almost been. Every passenger stared forward, some with awe, some with disbelief, others with shame etched across their faces. They had whispered about her, cursed her under their breath, doubted her sanity. Now she stood, unshaken, the hum of the engines her only companion. The captain, chest heaving, turned toward her. His voice, rough from the struggle, softened into something reverent. "Who are you?" Her eyes met his, calm and clear, steady as the horizon. She didn't hesitate, just someone who didn't forget how to breathe. The words hung in the air, a simple truth that felt heavier than any explanation could. But before the silence could settle, another voice broke it. From row 17, a man stood, his movements deliberate, his eyes sharp despite the years etched across his scarred face. He had blended in during the chaos, just another passenger hunched low, but now his presence filled the aisle. He wore no badge, but his bearing carried authority. His voice, low but certain, carried through the stunned cabin. "Sergeant Hale," he said, the name heavy with recognition. "Special Forces, I thought you disappeared." A ripple went through the rows. The whispers that followed were jagged, tangled with disbelief and apology. She was military? All this time? God, we were wrong. Some turned in their seats, eyes wide, mouths parted in awe. Others couldn't look at her at all, their shame too sharp, their earlier words echoing back at them like curses they wished they could swallow. She didn't confirm, didn't deny. Her silence was answer enough. The weight of truth filled the air, and nobody dared press her further. The captain adjusted the controls, his hands steadying now, his eyes still flicking toward her as though grounding himself in her presence. He knew she hadn't just saved the plane. She had altered the air in the cabin, rewoven the threads of fear into something different. Calm had become power, and they had all seen it with their own eyes. As the engines hummed and the plane cut clean through the night sky, he glanced at her once more. Her gaze was fixed out the window, the vast darkness stretching endless around them. To the passengers, she was the soldier who appeared when death closed in. To him, she was proof that strength wasn't in shouting, wasn't in panic, it was in the quiet refusal to break. And at 30,000 feet, with the stars scattered cold across the black, everyone knew the truth. She had changed everything.